futures of humanity and our living planet are at risk. We are at a turning point. Urgent action is needed to change course and transform the future. Everyone alive today has a tremendous obligation to future generations to ensure that their world is one of human rights, abundance, and not scarcity. Education is one of the key ways we address inequality, exclusion, and work on healing our damaged planet. But to transform the world, education needs to be transformed. UNESCO launched its Futures of Education initiative to bring the world together to reimagine how education can shape the future. Despite the urgency of action and in conditions of great uncertainty, we have reason to be full of hope. Education can help us make a peaceful, just, and sustainable world. For this, we need to renew education by asking what that we do now should be continued, what should be abandoned, and what needs to be invented afresh. A new social contract for education needs to be built. Collectively, we must strengthen education as a global common good. Let's all work together in our communities and across the world to ensure that education best supports our shared futures.
I got it. Good day. Assalamu alaikum. Bonjour. Buenos. If I do not know your language, I'm very sorry. The aim is to make sure that we are here and we feel welcome. So my name is Cindy Lengubane, and I will be facilitating this session for you. Allow me to welcome you. The theme of this conference is reimagining our futures together. So you sit there and start engaging with us and be creative. You know, don't just sit there, but enjoy this and think with us, because at the end of this conference, we should be able to agree that in 2050, education will be totally different. So I welcome you again, and I would like to welcome our first is Professor Puleng Lenkabula.
You are mute, Cindy. Cindy, you are mute, we cannot hear you. And perhaps people can switch off their microphones.
Okay, now.
Cindy, you are muted.
I've been talking all along.
No, you can start from the just not long.
Okay, thank you so much. So allow me, please, apologies for that. I don't know how I got again. Yes, our first guest is going to be Professor Puleng Lenkabula, who's the Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of South Africa. And our next guest will be Josep Duart, who's from the University of the Futures. And our last will be Dr. Sobhi Tawil, who's the Director of Futures of Learning at UNESCO. You are most welcome. So I will ask with respect that Professor Lenkabula opens this conference. Thank you.
Good afternoon, good day, good morning, wherever you are in the world. I was wondering if you could hear me, Prof.
Yes.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the program director. Please let me know if you can see me. If you can't, please advise. Are we in good stead? Thank you very much. Yes. Thank you very much, program director, for inviting us. I would like to thank you and greet you all wherever you are in the world. We as the University of South Africa are appreciative to co-hosting this august event where we are going to deliberate on futures and the roles of higher education in shaping such futures. I want to start by first acknowledging Josep M. Duart, Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences at University of Future Network in Catalonia, Spain. I also want to acknowledge Sobhi Tawil, Director of Future of Learning and Innovation Team, Keith Holmes, Program Specialist, Future of Learning and Innovation Team at UNESCO, Asha Kanwa, President and Chief Executive Officer, Commonwealth of Learning, Zulkifli Abdul Razak, I practiced, Rector, International Islamic University, Malaysia, and Jose Luis Guzman Matel, who's the Secretariat Section for Higher Education, UNESCO, and my colleagues from the University of South Africa and all over the continent. I'm truly delighted to have been given the opportunity to welcome you all to the university, the one fondly called the University of the Land, that is the University of South Africa. We as a university understand our role as an important one for mediating distance, whilst also allowing that distance become a lever for ensuring that higher education systems become available for those who want to participate, but also for those who do not have opportunities in the contact university. Our university will be turning 150 years, having been started in 1873, next year in 2023. And this is quite an important feat, for the university was born first as an examination body, but with inventive spirit around the imperative for expanding access for higher education. Therefore, it developed as a distance education university. Embracing the concept that university must be at the center of forming intellectuals who contribute to the country, to the continent, and to the global knowledge arena, our university has been in the forefront of shaping futures in the service of humanity, not only for the African continent, but for the global arena. There's nowhere in the world that we cannot find a UNISA graduate. And that's a contribution that we do not take for granted. We embrace the idea that in the contradictions of climatic changes, ecological degradation, humanity's contestations around being, that notion of ontology, but also the epistemological and philosophical ideas about creating meaning in the 21st century and in its futures. The issues of social justice, knowledge for development, and knowledge for humanizing communities in these contested environments become important arenas for higher education, not only just in science, innovation, but also in the creation of knowledge systems that are conducive to promoting social justice, human dignity, overcoming climatic changes that we are seeing, as well as ecological degradation through ecological justice and sensitization to the idea that for us to protect knowledge systems, we must at the same time ensure that we have protected the health and well-being, but also the existential aspect of humanity as it seeks to make meaning. The core of our existence is grounded on the need to address also the injustices of the past, but ensuring that no one is left behind. Therefore, Chairperson, in the context of opportunities that the 4.0 industrialization brings that the partnerships of universities with UNESCO, but also with each other, become important to ensuring that the intellectual futures of South Africa, the continent, and the world is protected, with an understanding that we do not exist as individuals, but also exist as individuals who are inextricably bound to society, to Earth, planetary systems, as well as other planets. Therefore, with the requisite responsibility to ensuring that it is not just liberal humanities or digital humanities that are promoted, but those notions that take into cognizance the collectivist approaches that many of us in the continent of Africa, through the philosophy of Ubuntu, that which reminds us about the nexus of humanity with ecology, and that we are inextricably bound to each other, and therefore to be empathetic, caring, and producing knowledge and innovations that are transformative of that which brings us to the underside. This is particularly important for the future of universities. For universities in the past were considered elite environments where only those with the requisite financial resources could advance themselves and their pursuit for wisdom or knowledge. The universities of the future, I'd like to assert, are universities that take seriously the imperative for health and well-being in the aftermath of COVID-19 that has made us aware of our vulnerability as humanity, but which has also invited that knowledge is resourceful if it embeds the respect and dignity of humanity, as well as the understanding of the distributive challenges that the world and our country contends with. Those bifurcations of society that sometimes accelerate even or exacerbate even the challenges that we're talking about. So for us as the University of South Africa, our commitments are not only in thinking around futures where dignity interface with ecological justice. They are also around where access to the university and success, and where digital inventions create and mediate distances, whether geospatial distance, disciplinary distance, multidisciplinary engagements, but also the engagement between natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities for the benefit of society. Part of the reason that we may be making these attempts, colleagues, is precisely because we probably are thinking about the futures, because the futures that South Africa, the African continent, but also the global community must imagine must not be similar to the past that negated some of the points that I've already elucidated upon. We also would like to ensure that we don't just work with inherited legacies, whether of colonial, patriarchal, apartheid, or indifferent even to ideas of dignity, that people who want universal access, either because of disabilities or because of marginality, are not proffered. We must ensure that these become an accessible education. Therefore, apartheid education taught us that bifurcations create bifurcations in access to higher education, create vulnerability in transforming socially cohesive environments, communities, epistemic communities, and knowledge systems, and thus call for decolonial, anti-colonial, but also humanizing and ecologically attentive knowledge systems. We are aware that because of the climatic changes, colleagues, that there are countries that may plunge because of these environmental challenges. And as thus, we imagine a future where higher education systems, including UNESCO World Higher Education Conference, the University of the Futures Network, in partnership with UNESCO, will be organizing a conference hosted by us as UNISA as well, with the idea of bringing higher education systems together, colleagues, academics, students, and global thinkers to reimagine the place of higher education. Critical questions that I've had around higher education, its access, have in the main been around the neoliberal posture of higher education, that notion of commercialization that the scholar Mahmoud Mamdani, as well as Amina Mama, remind us that will not help us with sustainability if we don't also think around how we together create economic systems that enable access even on those who are on the margins, including overcoming digital access, which can be a critical challenge for the future. As I try to work towards the conclusion in welcoming you, I want to remind us that, Chairperson and colleagues, that in the past, we cannot be beholden to the past though. We cannot allow also the past anomalies or challenges of universities' development of knowledge to stop us from reimagining the future. We therefore, whilst appreciating the evolution, genealogy of higher education, its history, structures, systems, practices that we should envision, that we should ensure that we reimagine the future in ways that knowledge becomes accessible. We must ensure that the current trends where growing populations of young people, fast-paced urbanization, hit by climate changes, social problems such as poverty, see higher education as a lever for extricating themselves from that which disables them. We must also see technology as an important enabler for education systems in order that we reach out even more people, but also use multiplicities of modalities to ensuring higher education accessibility and successes. And as well, colleagues, in reimagining the future, we recognize that our own national development plan, as well as the African Union Agenda 2063, and globally, the Global Sustainable Development Goals, help us to envision a future where knowledge, research, translation of such research into products, processes, systems, and enablers for people, planet, and sustainability coalesce. And I'm of the view that for us to then have such a future, we must ensure that we don't lose these critical principles that help us not to repeat the past mistakes of higher education. I also want to draw with the founder of the University of Al-Quran in Fez, Morocco, one of the first universities in the world, that we must be attentive to those on the margins, particularly women and marginalized communities such as the LGBTQIA+ communities, whose knowledge systems are often hidden in our universities, and to ensure that the future imagination of universities takes into cognizance feminist, womanist, Bosadi, and other theoretical frameworks that often have been negated in scholarship, whether of the past century or even of the present, such that women and all who have talents and potential and knowledge systems that can be harnessed to emancipatory processes, that they can be proffered such opportunities, for we still believe in education as a public good, a common good, in concert with philosophers that have reminded us. In the words of one of the feminist scholars, Mpine Makoe, whose work I find quite helpful in reimagining universities for the future, I'd like to quote somewhat at length her words. She says, "We redefine the meaning of academic freedom away from the old bourgeois individualistic and colonial thinking, Africanizing it by locating it within our continent and the imperatives for freedom of thought, which is a critical principle for knowledge systems. We also asserted academic freedom, the languages that we use for knowledge, the participation, and expanding this to shifting from the ivory tower notions of the academy. I want to therefore conclude by stating, colleagues, that public interest drives all the struggles for dignity, emancipation, and innovation. And therefore, whilst private interests are important to serve and service in higher education, the primacy would be in ensuring a global system that is attentive. I recognize you, Madam Program Director, that we, in the spirit of time, that we must ensure our conclusion. I would like to conclude by saying the higher education we aspire for should be the one that addresses environmental issues, how we coexist with our planet. It also ought to be developmental in nature, thus offering opportunities for homegrown development solutions, endogenous and indigenous knowledge system, whilst attentive to the global innovation systems. It must also try to ensure that we don't just live in the spaces of theorization and ideation, but must at the same time translate to those processes and systems that will make 2050 a reality that we all appreciate. I wish you all the best in the deliberations of today, but also in the conference, understanding with us as the University of South Africa to really wish you all the best. May this conference be a success, and I appreciate the investment in time, talent, and resources that has been made. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. You know, this is a generous welcome. Normally, my VC would take more than this. This is passion, and that is why I have made sure that the bios are on the chat so that we can save on time. So please welcome, feel welcome to the conference, just like Prof. Leon-Kabula has mentioned, and I would welcome Josep to take over. And that's a welcome from the University of the Futures Network. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sibyl. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's a pleasure to me to address today a few words to all of you during this opening session of this online event about reimagining the future of higher education towards 2050. This event that is organized in collaboration with UNESCO and the University of South Africa, UNISA. I'm here on behalf of the University of the Future Network. This network was an initiative of a colleague of myself. It's Professor Martha Burkley, who she will be at the end of this conference in the closing session, and also myself. In 2016, we decided then to invite 12 researchers, having the idea to create this network, the University of the Future Network. And we started with a meeting in Barcelona, in my university. It's the Open University of Catalonia. This was the first meeting in 2016, but of course we have been celebrating other meetings during these years until today. I remember that the first meeting, the title of the first meeting was The Universities of the Future, Educational and Organizational Changes. And I would like to remark these universities in plural, not because at the beginning we started thinking that there is not only one future for the higher education or for the universities. The idea, of course, as we can see now, and as we will see during this event, and also during the higher education, the World Higher Education Conference of UNESCO in Barcelona in May, so many other scenarios and futures exist for higher education and for our universities. The discussion in Barcelona was about these educational and organizational challenges, but we organized other meetings. For instance, the next one was organized by the Fern University, our colleague Eva Cendon, who is always is also here in this event. And the topic of this conference was about digitalization, because we would like in this conference, in this network, to discuss about the different topics that affects to the futures of the higher education. We have another meeting in Philadelphia, in that case in the University of Pennsylvania, led by our colleague Alec Gersbeck. In that case, we opened the ideas to discuss, and we were discussing about global universities approaches, and also equitable university and lifelong learning and at the university level. And we have the opportunity there to discuss with many other colleagues from other universities in America. And in 2019, we had our meeting in Milano, led by our colleague Andrea Mangiatordi. And in that case, our focus was related to the innovation and the dialogue with companies, and firms and companies. As you know, this is a very important topic for the universities. And of course, it's another topic of interest for the futures of universities. Not in 2020, sorry, at the end of 2020, during the pandemic period, our meeting was virtual and was hosted by the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina. And in that case, the leader was Karina Leon. And in that moment, we started talking about the transformation of higher education during this period of the pandemic period, and with a particular focus, starting there with a particular focus of the South American region of the world. And now we are starting this meeting here in South Africa, hosted by University of South Africa. And the idea is always to have a clear and open discussion between researchers and having this idea to see and approach the different researchers that we can have about these topics and the topics that we will discuss during this meeting. And we are so very proud to have with us the collaboration and working together, of course, with UNESCO in order to celebrate this event that we are starting now. The focus of this event will be about the research methodologies to study the future. As researchers, we need to define and to clarify what kind of research methodologies we can use to analyze these futures. And also, we would like to discuss and to analyze the different perspectives of these futures, in particular from the different points of view from the different regions in the world. I'm sure this event will be very, very interesting for all of us, but let me just share with you some thoughts also as a researcher, and as a professor in the area of education and pedagogy and related with new educational models, etc. I'm thinking now that we are living a very, very interesting moment, And we need platforms, events like this to have a clear approach from the research with data in order to discuss new and explore new proposals and new scenarios. I think that we have a very huge challenge in order to explore what is happening now and how the higher education institutions are in clear process of transformation. And this transformation impacts in everything in the university. Of course, it's have a clear impact on the process, on the educational process and teaching and learning process. We are calling now this digital education, and also have a clear impact in the way that the universities is managed and organized. And in that case, I think it's clear that we need strong new kinds of leaderships, very transformative leaders with the capabilities and the skills to manage this new situation, this transformative situations with clear skills in order to make these universities prepare for the future and for the present, of course, more sustainable, more clear with equity, etc., as the Vice Chancellor of UNISA was explaining us at the beginning a few minutes ago. And of course, this transformation that the universities are experiencing now have also a clear impact on the dialogue that the universities have with its context. That means with the society in general, with the problems and the situation in each society, environmental problems and the climate change, etc. But also now with the companies and the needs and the training and the learning needs in the society. I think that we have a very important challenge, and I'm sure that during this conference we will receive a lot of inputs, a lot of proposals to continue discussing about these topics. Let me finish these words just saying thank you, very, very much thank you to all of the people that made possible this conference, this event. In particular, our colleagues from UNISA, and more in particular with our colleague Mpine Makoe, the professor of the University of South Africa. Of course, our colleagues from UNESCO, and in particular Keith Holmes, who was from the beginning and they're collaborating with us on the preparation of this university. And of course, all of the people of in our network, the University of the Future Network. As you know, we don't have the clear or the real power not to predict the future. We would like to have it, but it's not possible. But we have some skills, as we will discuss during this event, in order to see what kind of futures we will have in the future. But as individuals, as persons, as researchers, we have a strong power to influence that the things to come. That means that the things to make these things possible. Let's use that power. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Prof. Duart, if you were here in South Africa and UNISA was hosting physically, when you are done, you are going to be getting all these things like the, you know, we are Africans and we are full of energy. So let's share this energy. I see people are joining, and as we are getting more and more participants, Prof. Duart has said, we have the power to predict and decide how education is going to be in the future. Allow me to welcome Sobhi Tawil, the Director of Future of Learning and Innovation team at UNESCO, to also pass his opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to be here. Professor Puleng Lenkabula, Vice Chancellor of the University of South Africa, Josep Duarte, and members of the University of the Future Network and UNESCO shareholders that are participating in the seminar, and ladies and gentlemen. Really a pleasure to be here, and on behalf of the Director General of UNESCO, to add my welcome to this conference, to this two-day conference on reimagining the futures of higher education toward 2050. First, I'd like to thank the University of the Future Network coordinators for their vision, their foresight, and to the University of South Africa for generously hosting this online event. It is appropriate that this event be hosted by a South African higher education institution, knowing that South African students have been at the forefront of rethinking higher education and campaigning for genuine access, inclusion, equality, and change in higher education. Reimagining the futures of higher education towards 2050, perhaps useful to recall that just 2 years ago, prior to the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, UNESCO launched the Futures of Education initiative. And this set out to reimagine how knowledge and learning can help shape the future of humanity and the planet, desirable, possible, alternative futures. And last November, the International Commission on the Futures of Education, informed by a broad process of consultation, dialogue, and co-creation, the Commission released its report, Reimagining Our Futures Together, a new social contract for education. And the report invites dialogue, research, action, innovation around three simple yet key questions for education as we look to the future. One, what should we continue doing? What in our practices are positive and need to be maintained, strengthened, perhaps even protected, because these are dimensions that are being undermined. So what should we continue doing? Second, what should we abandon? What in our practices, our policies and our practices are actually holding us back from the ambitions that we have for a higher education, for a role for higher education in more contributing to more inclusive, more just, and more sustainable futures. And three, what do we need to reimagine in this particular historical juncture that we find ourselves in? And these questions have become more pressing with COVID-19 pandemic and the disruption of educational processes to different degrees in different contexts and for different levels of education. In any case, the report of the International Commission is not a blueprint. It's not a prediction and a forecasting exercise, but rather an invitation for all those concerned, involved in education, in higher education in particular, to take up and contextualize these questions together with their partners in particular spaces, within particular dynamics and contexts. Just to add that our UNESCO Institute specialized in higher education, and within this broader framework has also launched, as many of you would know, a series of dialogues with different constituencies, a visioning type of exercise on the futures of higher education. It was mentioned just before, but there are numerous opportunities to engage this year. Obviously, the World Conference on Higher Education in Barcelona in May, but there are also other opportunities to engage with the ideas in the report on the futures of education. And I'm thinking particularly of a series of national dialogues, national consultations that are being planned by the UN and ahead of a summit that the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is organizing in September of this year on transforming education, the Transforming Education Summit this September. And so there will be opportunities in the dialogues, the national dialogues and consultations, and efforts to engage the public in committing to and contributing to the transformation of education. Perhaps just to mention that at the launch of the report of the International Commission on the Futures of Education last November, the Secretary General of the UN did observe, and I'm quoting, "Education is a foundation for inclusive societies. It shapes the minds of people across the world as they fulfill their aspirations, both individual and collective. It is a key to resolving many of the global and local challenges we face. We cannot heal a damaged planet, narrow huge inequalities, secure the rights of women and girls, strengthen trust, or build peace without a strong commitment to education. And in the face of profound social, political, economic, environmental, and technological change, there is a growing consensus that today's education systems are no longer fit for purpose." A citation then from the UN Secretary General at the launch event for the report on the futures of education, the reports of the International Commission. And as I mentioned in the title, it calls for a new social contract for education. One, a new social contract that can repair past injustices, that can help us meet the unfulfilled promises and commitments that we have made in terms of right to education for all, and at the same time transform the future. So a social contract built around principles of inclusion and equity, of cooperation and solidarity, of collective responsibility, and a recognition of our interconnectedness and our interdependencies. As was mentioned, also an important year for the World Higher Education Conference happening in May of this year, and an important moment that international higher education stakeholders can gather. This is the third conference. The second conference was in 2009, so quite some time ago. So an excellent opportunity for higher education stakeholders to come together, reflect on progress made, on evolution of our societies and our environment since then, and to consider and explore how higher education can address the challenges of our times, of this juncture that we're at. And here, perhaps, two of the foundational principles that are proposed in the report of the International Commission, two foundational principles for a new social contract, might be useful starting points. And the first principle, or the first principle, is an expanded understanding of the right to education, expanded in seeing the right to education as lifelong, but also seeing the right to education more closely connected to the right to information, the right to science, to culture. In short, the right to access and contribute to the knowledge commons as part of our shared common living heritage. Second foundational principle for a new social contract education, or a reaffirmation, that higher education, like education more generally, more globally, is a collective endeavor and a common good. And we know that higher education has often been too elitist and has perpetuated exclusions and social and economic inequalities. We know that certain worldviews and epistemologies have become dominant, often at the expense of others and of the diversity of knowledge systems that we have. So that higher education should appreciate cultural diversity, defend human rights, combat all forms of discrimination, and promote social justice within higher education institutions and within the broader community. So higher education really needs reimagining, not least to recognize the multiple forms of knowledge. And we're currently in academic environments not that good at rewarding and recognizing and rewarding interdisciplinary research, cultural and epistemic diversity, recognition and engagement with indigenous knowledge, collaborative action, research with local communities. There needs to be more recognition of these ways of engaging with knowledge and of creating knowledge. And perhaps finally, by decolonizing knowledge and valuing plural ways of knowing and of doing, higher education institutions can make significant contributions to open science, to broadening the knowledge commons, to enhancing inclusiveness and diversity. Perhaps just to end on a note, which is a thread that runs through the report of the Commission on the Futures of Education. It's really cooperation rather than competition that must be our key principle in looking at possible alternative desirable futures and the role that higher education can play in moving us in these directions. This conference promises really to bridge some of the theory and practice, some of the visioning and the policy making, and good to see the diversity of profiles of participants, including students, researchers, policymakers, and that's a strength. We hope that this event and this meaningful conversation on reimagining the futures of higher education and beyond can encourage continued engagement in the consultations leading up to the World Higher Education Conference in May. And looking very much forward, again, very pleased to be partnering for this conference with the University of South Africa, the University of the Future Network. With thanks again, and to the organizers, to the hosts, and looking forward to the conference and wishing all success for the 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sobhi. I think we all agree that now that the three hosts, UNISA, UFN, and UNESCO, have officially welcomed us now, we may declare the conference open. And I would like to welcome you to please engage on the chat. The fact that we are talking and interacting online means that we must network online. So please get busy on the chat. And therefore, I will hand over the next session to Martha Battle, the Assistant Dean of Evaluation at the University of Arizona. Thank you so much. Enjoy.
Thank you so much. Good morning to all. I hope you had a chance to have a biological break in between or something. We are very, very happy to be here. We are extremely pleased to introduce our keynote speaker of the day, who is Dr. Keri Facer. And I'm going to read a little bit about her biography. She's wonderful. She is a professor of educational and social futures at the University of Bristol and professor of education for sustainable development at the University of Gothenburg. She has spent 2 decades working on the relationship between education and disruptive futures, with a particular attention to the implications of both technological and climate change for educational purpose and practices. Her previous roles have included positions as Research Director of Future Lab, leader of the UK government's Beyond Current Horizons Foresight Programme for Education, UKRI Leadership Fellow for a £40 million national research programme that brought together universities and civil society in collaborative research, and Centrum Guest Professor in Climate Change, Leadership at Uppsala University. She was a member of the Expert Advisory Group for the UNESCO Futures of Education Commission, and past collaborators have included work with everyone from the BBC and Microsoft. So I am very pleased and honored to introduce you to Dr. Keri Facer. Thank you so much.
Hello, everybody. It's really nice to meet you. I'm assuming that somebody is about to start playing the talk that I've recorded for you. So I will wait until that happens and just leave the floor to whoever is playing that, and I will see you at the end for some questions. So hello, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm really looking forward to the conversations over the course of this conference. And a quick heads up, these are probably the most boring slides I've ever produced, so feel free to treat this as a podcast and just listen. So what I want to do today is talk about the relationship between these three ideas: reimagining, higher education, and sustainable futures, that form the basis for the title of this conference. And in particular, what I want to do is I want to argue that higher education has a distinctive role in supporting societies and individuals to imagine what sustainable futures might look like and helping to turn them into a reality. But in order to play this role, we're going to need to reimagine ourselves and our universities and colleges today. So, what do we mean by sustainable futures in higher education? Well, let's assume it's not just this, okay? It's not just some vacuous greening of our current world where we assume that everything carries on at present. This is the image that Microsoft gave me when I started drafting the slides for this talk. And I think it captures precisely what reimagining higher education for sustainable futures should not look like. In other words, business as usual with just shiny teeth, great hair, and a few green trees. Instead, this sort of fantasy greenwashing is really not what the serious conversations such as the one we're having today should be concerned with. I want instead to assume that by sustainable futures beyond 2030, we are in fact serious about working in the real world. We mean the creation of a world where our collective and personal well-being is not dependent on the exploitation and extraction of other people and of other beings on the planet for the profit of an ever smaller minority. I want to assume that we mean by sustainable futures a world where we've been able to develop ways of living that better enable all children and adults to live lives of dignity and respect. I want to suggest that we mean a world where we've worked out how to redesign our cities, our communities, our food, our health, our education systems, and our political systems in ways that are compatible with planetary boundaries. So I'm going to give the rest of this talk as though we are all serious about this vision, about this idea of creating these sorts of sustainable futures over the period of, let's say, I'm going to suggest 50 years. Because why on earth would we want to spend our time trying to work towards something less than this? But even as I say this, I'm aware of the risk and the danger of starting with these sorts of aspirations and statements. I'm aware that it's both cooler, not to mention more academically acceptable, to play the skeptic, to talk about what is not possible, to explain precisely why such ideas of a sustainable future are dangerously fantastic. But this is precisely the point I want to make at the start of this talk. creating sustainable futures requires an act of stubborn imagination, one that recognizes and states quite clearly that business as usual is ecologically, ethically, and economically unsustainable. If we're serious about sustainable futures, then we're going to need to think and imagine differently. We're going to have to start asking big, hard, and challenging questions, developing new propositions, and experimenting with what these might look like. And I'm not the only one saying these sorts of things. Policy specialists like Jeff Mulgan, who have spent years working in and alongside government, have been making the case that we need to foster a much more creative policy imagination for many years now. So too have those working as part of the World Social Forum. There's also good research evidence from anthropology, psychology, political sciences, and others that the capacity to imagine strong and desirable images of the future is essential to being able to achieve them. And indeed, if we don't start developing our own desirable images, then others will do it for us. Some of the greatest proponents of imaginative futures practice since World War II, after all, have been commercial organizations, in particular oil and gas companies. And Jenny Anderson's history of the futures field shows how commercial futures practices have shaped geopolitical decision-making and corporate strategy. We're living in a world, at least in part, envisaged and imagined by corporate futurists. And if it isn't the oil and gas companies, then it's the techno-fantasies of tech billionaires that are making the news. Visions that are more concerned with the creation of free enterprise zones on Mars, oblivious to what's going on Earth. And our cultural industries aren't particularly helping much either. Hollywood, New York, and Bollywood are pumping out images of apocalypse, escapist fantasies, or dark thrillers where everything works out fine in the end. So are we surprised that under these conditions, young people are struggling to create images and ideas of the future that offer hope? A recent survey is instructive. A survey of 10,000 young people across Australia, Brazil, Finland, France, India, Nigeria, Philippines, Portugal, the UK, and the USA found that 75% of them saw the future as frightening. So if we're serious about the idea of sustainable futures after 2030, the world will need a stubborn social imagination that's able to work against these manufactured images of fantasy or apocalypse and begin to envisage the possibility of better futures. We need, in other words, a new imagination infrastructure that is able to work against these images and that systematically normalizes opportunities for people, whatever their collection, their wealth, or their qualifications, to participate in acts of collective social imagination and translate them into everyday social experimentation. Universities are or should be central to this task. We're at the heart of many communities. We promise students and societies that will help prepare them for the future. We've got people, we've got resources, we've got buildings and knowledge. Our institutions of higher education should be key anchor organizations of any infrastructure of the imagination. But we're not. We have high walls that keep out those without the ability to pay and trap those who can and do pay in debt for many years. Many of us have partnerships with fossil industries, mining industries, and financial industries that are part of the processes of extraction and exploitation that we need to challenge. Some of these companies, particularly in the Anglosphere, have roles on our boards of governors and are designing our courses. And we risk also being complicit in the idea that the purpose of education is individualized investment in human capital, even as the returns on that investment are demonstrably and massively diminishing. Our imaginations in universities, in other words, have been colonized by the short term, the small scale, and the status quo. We need then to reimagine ourselves before we can play a role in supporting our capacity, supporting our society to reimagine itself for sustainable futures. If it's any comfort, we're not alone in this sort of challenge. We're living in interesting times when hard questions are being asked of all major institutions. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2019, for example, argued that if we're to create a viable future below 1.5 degrees of warming, all social institutions, from transport systems to housing, would require rapid, far-reaching and transformational reform. Why would higher education be exempt from such a demand? So what can help us as we begin to think about how we might reimagine ourselves in universities? What can help us overcome our habits of thought that mean we're constantly drawn into an obsession with league tables, with our latest publications, with our student figures? What can help us begin to dream as educators and policymakers about what higher education might become? Well, good news is there's a growing body of research and practice on what can help fuel the imagination. It comes from fields as diverse as design thinking, future studies, the arts, philosophy, politics, sociology. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through some of these. Think about what their implications might be for how we go about this task of reimagining higher education over the next couple of days, and use it in the end to create a story, an imagination of a potential future university as a tool for thinking with. So the first set of resources for helping fuel our imagination and support our imagination are what I would call ontological resources. They're statements about reality that help us, if you like, liberate our imagination. So the first resource is simply the statement that things might be otherwise. That powerful phrase, what if things were different, is at the heart of imaginative practice. It's the circle that we draw on the floor into which we dream and create other worlds as kids. It's the hypothesis that drives scientific inquiry. Asking this question, what if, is not an innate ability, it can be fueled. Many practices can be used to help remind us that change happens, that there are alternatives, that what if is possible. At its simplest, we can look to history. Things have not always been the way they are now. Or we can look to geography. There are other practices in other places. We only have to look at the history and the geography of universities to see that this is the case, that there is no one model, no one reality. We can also look to the ideas of those who are different from us. How do things look from the perspective of those in a different position with a different angle on what they're seeing? An experiment here is lift your arm up and circle your thumb around above your head. Put it in a clockwise direction, okay? And then move it down and look at it below you and see what direction it's facing then. Okay, things look different from different angles. That's a resource for the imagination. We can also shift our time frame. We can imagine that we're working on a 100-year or 200-year time scale. What becomes possible or impossible if we think about that time scale rather than about next week? And our what-if capacities can also be developed by playing with different theories of change. What if there was a backlash to what we did? What if things go in circles or waves? What if what looks dominant now was actually on the verge of collapse? And they can be fueled by exploring what Bill Sharp and his colleagues at the Institute for the Future call the second horizon, the emergent possibilities in the present, looking at what seems to be just at the margins of the mainstream, the interventions and practices that we can dismiss as irrelevant now, but that might be harnessed to create the futures that we want. So strengthening the imagination begins here with assuming that what we can see of present reality is not a good guide, either to the totality of what's happening now or to the possibility of what might emerge. To develop a powerful imagination, however, also requires an understanding of our own agency. We need to think not only about what the world is like, but of our place within it. After all, the imagination combined with a feeling of powerlessness leads to depression and anxiety. It's not enough to be able to just imagine. We have to believe that we matter, that our imaginations might lead to something. This can be quite difficult for academics, in particular sociologists, to believe. We're trained to identify power and structure, to see obstacles, to identify what we're up against. But today, the worlds of philosophy and physics are coming to our rescue finally, helping us to understand that we live in a world of myriad processes and entangled relationships in which the smallest actions can have unintended and untraceable consequences. Here I'm talking about a recognition of the world as complex. It's not complicated, but complex. This is a world in which phase changes and major shifts can happen at a much faster rate for good or for bad than we might have thought. This is a world, in other words, in which we matter, however small we feel we are, even if we're not quite sure how we matter or know in advance the effects of what we do. In other words, we aren't simply cogs in a machine or slaves in a system of hierarchies in which our job is to get control of the system in order to achieve predictable outcomes. We might be better to think of ourselves as imperfect agents in a world of waves, of ripples, of diffracted actions, in which we're not working alone, but dancing along as part of a much bigger picture. We can, in other words, imagine ourselves as agents who are both not in control and who are potentially and unpredictably influential. In this context, who knows what we might achieve? Relatedly, we have to recognize that our agency occurs as part of a wider world that has its own features. So far, the things I've been saying suggest that I see imaginative practice as simply as a cognitive matter, as though the imagination was a question of just thinking and willing. And yet we live in a world that has histories and materiality. We do not start from scratch. One aspect of this is that anytime something new emerges, it enters into a world of unequal resources, where some will be better placed than others to appropriate this novelty and exploit it. Any act of the imagination then needs to engage with this existing unequal world and work out how to mitigate its effects. A second aspect is that we're living in a world with features that are fundamentally beyond our control. We are governed by physics and thermodynamics, by the laws of the water cycle and the carbon cycle, by the availability of the minerals that we have and the agent energy we can create. We live alongside other beings that have their own interests, relationships, and concerns. Our imagination cannot and must not pretend that these conditions and interdependencies do not exist. To quote Madonna, although I have a feel she meant something different, we are material beings in a material world. Our imagination needs to dance with that materiality, not wave it away. For example, we can't premise our thinking about a future world on carbon offsetting plans that require land currently needed also for food and housing, or assume that we can keep emitting carbon dioxide now because some magical future carbon capture technologies will appear. Nurturing the imagination is fundamentally different from encouraging wishful thinking and technological fantasy. It is much more rigorous. So these then are the ontological conditions for the imagination that create some restraints as we think about our future university. They give us three potential design principles for working with. They help us recognize that the university can and will change, that the present is not a good guide to the future, that different forms of teaching and learning, governance and organization, curriculum and disciplines can and likely will come into being. They invite us to recognize that our agency as educators and policymakers isn't absolute. We're not in control, but equally we are not irrelevant. We can attempt to tip the balance towards sustainable futures in a complex system. And finally, they remind us that any future university will need to operate within material constraints and address historic inequalities and injustices. Nurturing the imagination, however, is not just a question of playing with existing resources. It's also a question of normativity, a question of what we want to move away from and what we want to move towards. If we look to history, politics, and popular education, for example, we can see that a powerful resource for the imagination is the force of refusal, the act of saying, no, this is not okay. In the practices of Paulo Freire, we see that it is the work of drawing on our daily observations of what is failing as a gap between what might be and what is, that is a resource for imagination and action. Indeed, the phrase the social imagination derives from the sociologist C. Wright Mill's idea of the sociological imagination, which invites us to draw connections between what each of us sees as a personal trouble to also name a collective social issue. In the words of the Zapatistas, we start with a collective no to open up the possibility of many yeses. The imagination in this case is fueled by a refusal to accept as normalized, as inevitable, what is clearly inhumane and harmful. This refusal, this no, is essential to the imagination. Without a critique of what is wrong, we end up with mindless fantasy. Imagination isn't just about playing with alternatives, it's about diagnosing problems and developing analysis and strategies to dismantle what isn't working. But educators, social movements, and designers who work in imagination all center the process of naming desires. Naming desires helps to bring new possibilities and realities into view that might not be visible from the present. Martin Luther King, for example, not only had a highly motivated network of civil society organizers, but a powerful dream that another world was possible. Desires and dreams are creative. As Audre Lorde, a woman whose work is essential in understanding the critical role of the imagination in social change, argues, we have been raised to fear the yes within ourselves, our deepest cravings. For the demands of our released expectations lead us inevitably into actions which will help bring our lives into accordance with our needs, our knowledge, our desires. In other words, if we take seriously our desires, if we respect them and acknowledge them, we are going to have to start acting on trying to bring some of these into being. Naming desires and dreams is also useful to distinguish desirable from undesirable possibilities. It helps us to select, to make priorities. The entire critical utopian tradition of thought shows that desires, hopes, and dreams are powerful tools for allowing us to see possibilities in the present, for pulling latent potential into realities. In 2020, my colleagues, Steve Lewandowski, Ali Ecker, and I asked several thousand people in the US and the UK what they wanted from the world after the pandemic. What emerged from this was two observations. First, that people in general wanted a future characterized by fairness and sustainability. And secondly, that they tended to think that other people wouldn't want this future and would prefer a return to business as usual. This finding matters. It shows us why naming our desires and dreams is important, so that we can share them with others. Translating these two insights into our practice of reimagining the university, they point to two important moves. Firstly, that reimagining the future university should emerge from a rejection of economically and ecologically harmful practices. And second, that as we reimagine the university, this practice should emerge from our desire to create actually sustainable futures. It needs to be driven by clear images of the future that we want and a really clear assessment of whether these images of the future university that we're talking about are actually going to drive those sorts of really challenging, transformative, sustainable futures we imagine. So this requires deep honesty with our values, our desires, and our emotions. And finally, we can draw on the fields of design and future studies and psychology to identify the kind of affective resources that we need if we're going to get involved in this business, this tricky business of imagining. And the first of these is that by opening up the imagination, we also need to confront fear. Our imaginations can too easily be limited by what we don't want to think about or what we consider impossible or undesirable. James Data, the futurist from the University of Hawaii, talks about four myths of the future that we habitually fall into. Those where we tell the story that things will carry on as normal. The reformers story, who figure out that we just need to make a few changes and everything will stay the same. The transformers story, which is about something radical and disruptive happening to make everything better. And those who anticipate complete collapse. As we try to mobilize our imaginations, it's helpful to know which of these stories we're most comfortable with, which frighten us and which we try not to think about. It's worth sitting for a second to just think which of those stories you tend to turn to when you're thinking about the future of the university. Business as usual, constraint, collapse, transformation. But from this work, we also learn that imaginative practice is also a process of letting go. It's about allowing old ideas and ways of being to die. We're not just concerned here then with the imagination of midwifing something new into the world. We're also hospicing old ways of living into death. We need to think about what we're sad to lose, what we can't bear to part with, but what we have to let go. The art of imagination involves, in other words, emotions. It involves, in particular, the courage to confront what we fear, what we worry will happen, and what we're scared to lose. Imagination without action, however, is as a resource for anxiety and depression. And indeed, we can see this in all the work on eco-anxiety amongst young people. Central to the capacity to work well with the imagination in ways that aren't debilitating is the ability to experiment with others, to try things out and to test them. And we can see this throughout history in the prefigurative practices of social movements, entrepreneurs, and inventors. The work of acting as if a possibility were real helps to bring it into being, helps us to learn what works and to forge powerful relationships and communities of learning. Fostering the imagination, in other words, is tied to the practice of trying things out. As we think about reimagining the future of the university then, we need to attend to how our emotions, we need to attend to how our emotions are shaping our ideas of the future of the universities. What ideas can we not bear to imagine? What are we scared of? And we need to think and be clear that the idea of the future of the university that we come up with has to have some elements that can be prefigured or tested in the present in ways that allow us to assess them as a course of action and to build communities around. So that, if you like, is the baseline for thinking about how we might develop this process of reimagining higher education in ways that might make it a site for fostering and supporting the social imagination itself. These two things are related. If we can't imagine ourselves, what resources can we offer to others? So I'm going to play with these rules and these principles as a way of telling the story of a future university. I'm going to move myself down so you can look at the picture while we talk. As a way of using them to tell a story about the future university that will have emerged over the next 50 years to replace the way things are happening now. What I'm offering is not a prediction, and each of you listening would and should imagine a different story about the shape a university for sustainable futures might take in the years to come. But I share this in the spirit of cultivating our collective imaginations in this conference as an idea that might be tested or challenged, but that I hope will get us beyond the vague arm waving about sustainability and help us get, if you like, a more concrete sense of what a university committed to making sustainable futures in democratic and inclusive ways might look like. We start our story in the year 2072. Shut your eyes now if you fancy. It's easier to imagine with your eyes shut for some reason. We start our story in the year 2072, 50 years from now. We're observing a virtual common room, an immersive space where a group of people sit together swapping news about the weather from around the world, laughing at each other's bad jokes about politicians and swapping gardening tips. They live in many different countries: New Zealand, the UK, India, South Africa, and France. But they've come together in this virtual space as friends to catch up. We get the feeling as we watch them interact that they've known each other for many years and have worked together for a long time. Indeed, what's happening is that we're eavesdropping on one of the regular gatherings of the now happily retired founders of the University of the Social Imagination. And as we listen to them, we hear them begin to reminisce about that first gathering in 2022 that laid the groundwork for all that was to come. They remembered how that first meeting led in 2023 to launching a new index that they thought would provide a better measure of good higher education, what they called the Imagination Index, and the many, many battles that they faced with university trustees and students' unions to explain what they were doing and why. They remember the exposés they wrote at the same time of the role of corporate interests and big finance in the governance of universities and the questions that this led to in parliaments around the world. They remembered that first act of mass refusal in 2024, when, having developed a network of students and academics all over the place, they launched a program of mass disruption and boycott of the university ranking systems. They remember together when, in 2027, they agreed to cut their hours at the university to set up alongside it a shadow program of learning cooperatives that were designed to imagine new ways of tackling social challenges, from food supply to good housing, drawing on everything we know about history, on all the resources that are available online and in people and in places to help address these questions. They remembered how over the next 5 years, they gradually figured out how to make the transition to working in these cooperatives full time. They often laugh at how scared they felt when they made that change. They were worried about whether they'd have jobs or careers anymore. But the fact that most of them had been facing precarious and low-paid conditions for decades helped to make the transition a lot less frightening than it might have been otherwise. They remembered when they got their first crowd-funded investment in 2028 to create what they were calling for the first time the University of the Social Imagination, for a joint project between the twin cities of Cape Town and Delhi. This was the first time that their distinctive principle of praxis centres that combined grassroots expertise, indigenous knowledge and technological innovation was fully developed and applied to city innovation at scale. The things that we remember today as we look back from 2072 as the shockwaves of 2030 saw the University of the Social Imagination, or UZI as it now became known, really ready to respond. They had praxis learning centres operating across 12 countries and 50 cities. The massive droughts that hit Africa and Europe particularly hard, the heat waves that followed, the huge winds that prevented shipping of international goods caused significant food shortages. But UZI and its network swung into action. Resilience and adaptation techniques learned the hard way in South Africa and Arizona were shared with those facing food scarcity in the cities of Marseille and Bristol. The techniques of rural farmers and computer programmers in India who had resisted the control of agricultural companies for seed sharing had developed their own DIY biotechniques. All of this came to the forefront in supporting citizens to create a network of urban farms. Mayors in cities with UZI campuses rapidly saw their potential to create solutions to food scarcity, so began changing planning laws to help rezone neighbourhoods and offer low rents to allow the campuses to proliferate. They also surreptitiously began to facilitate a shift in funding from the old universities to the UZI campuses. Any surplus generated through these local food businesses was returned via the UZI network to continue to support the leading edge agricultural innovation in India. As these learning communities flourished, as the University for the Social Imagination developed, they created a mixed ownership cooperative economic model inspired by the old Mondragon networks in Spain, but married to newer crowdfunding approaches. By the mid-2040s, all of the praxis centres of UZI now around all of these countries were flourishing, not least because ongoing weather crises demanded rapid peer-to-peer knowledge sharing. No one was getting rich from them, but they were agile, provided enough money for people to run and manage the activities, and offered very low-cost learning opportunities. Not only were they useful then, but they were loved as they grew from the imagination and interests of the people in the local area. By the late 2040s, many of the alumni from the UZI, expert as they were in combining knowledge, action, and imagination, had gone on to play important roles in their communities, cities, and national politics. In particular, 2 of the former students had gone on to become senior ministers in their home countries. In 2050, a major conference was held, bringing together these alumni. There were a lot of issues on the agenda: how to create opportunities for late life learning, because nearly a quarter of the population in Asia and Europe was by that time aged over 65. How the new AI assistants could be incorporated into ways that built on their contribution but didn't let them take over. How hub centre facilities in refugee camps could restore biodiversity and capture carbon more effectively. Most interesting, however, was the proposal that these 2 ministers, the 2 former UZI students, had cooked up. And this proposal made the case that a mass cooperativization and comprehensivization of all universities in their 2 countries. The success of the University of the Social Imagination and its capacity to create powerful learning communities on the ground was at the heart of their arguments. It offered a model that they could point to and be learned from. This proposal for a cooperative and comprehensive university system was fought tooth and nail by many of the old universities in their 2 countries, particularly those that wanted to keep the high student fees, but was welcomed by others, in particular by those who were relieved to no longer be managed by hedge funds and who were keen to make connections to the grassroots and the communities where they lived and worked. Over the next decade, all the universities in these 2 countries became free to access comprehensive and cooperative institutions offering courses for those who needed them, and critically, not offering degree certificates. Indeed, the universities decided collectively that it should be no longer possible to say where you'd received a degree from, and so degrees were awarded at national level. This was met with some confusion, but also creativity, as everyone began to wonder how to use new criteria to communicate what they had learned. The new model in the two countries was looked at with concern by other countries around the world. The Americans saw it as creeping socialism, the state-led democracies saw it as a weakening of state power and influence. The huge challenges of the 2050s and 2060s, however, helped the model prove its worth. First, the mass migration generated by the huge heat waves and floods in South Asia saw these two countries welcome and rapidly create an education program on UC campuses for huge numbers of migrants. Compared with other nations, the social unrest was lower, the educational and economic gains of such large numbers of migrants were fostered and valued. Second, as the widespread general artificial intelligence came to pass in the late 2060s, and the question of how to live with the massive abundance of expertise and resources that this offered became a pressing one, these two countries, whose citizens had long ago learned that learning was oriented not just towards qualification, but towards the enhancement of the conditions of life, flourished. Their citizens, able to deal better with the strange possibility of life with few demands for work, had the collective imagination and wisdom to begin to rapidly harness this new superpower and begin to invent new worlds. And so this is where we return again to find those founders in that virtual common room in 2072. The early pioneers of the new universities who had struggled and fought to create something new from the ruins of a university system lost, they thought before, to profit and performance. There they are in 2072, getting on a bit now and gratefully accepting the support of next generations, but still imagining new worlds, dealing with the messes of the old one, and helping the establishment of new campuses of the University of the Social Imagination. In those countries who are rapidly learning that free, collectively owned education for social change and the imagination is a prerequisite to surviving both the problems and the potential of this long and complicated century. Is this a fairy tale or is it a cautionary tale? You decide. Our imaginations have for many years been stifled by narratives both of apocalypse and the thin stories of neoliberal economics that have reduced education to short-term, narrow goals of education for the economy. Our imaginations have also been stifled by the fear that we will be ridiculed if we name our desires. But the exercise of the imagination is essential to education as the practice of freedom. As Audre Lorde again argued, it is our dreams that point the way to freedom. So at the end of this talk, at the end of this particular story and this particular dream, what might we begin to realize? What pointers does it offer me? And this story gives me 3 practical questions. It makes me ask, can we create a social imagination index as a new way of judging the quality of our universities? Can we ask our students when they leave university whether they feel equipped to imagine and create sustainable futures for themselves and for the world? Second question, where are the examples of cooperative or alternative forms of financing for universities that might allow a combination of grassroots expertise and cutting-edge science and humanities to flourish with low economic barriers to participation? And finally, how well equipped are our universities for the inevitable mass migration of the next 50 years? In summary, reimagining universities for sustainable futures will necessarily and must be more than sticking green trees behind graduation photos. We don't know what the future will bring, but we do know that it will need an expansive, serious, intentional, and stubborn act of imagination to create the sorts of futures we might want to live in. It is far from clear that universities are currently up to this task. So we need to start to dream, to imagine what the paths might be to shift us in the direction we need, to create conditions of possibility for new ways of being a university. I hope that this conference can act as a starting point for this work of the stubborn imagination. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Keri. Thank you. We have some questions in the Q&A session. I think your talk was really inspiring. I found it provoking as well. your talk. I found it, many ideas that leave us thinking about, how the future looks, what are our roles in the future of the universities, of education in general. And since I am the facilitator, I would like to start with having the possibility of asking you a question, please. So in your presentation at the very beginning, you mentioned kind of sideways the role of big enterprises or big companies, like pulling away from the core of your university thinking. So my question to you is, do you think that currently or in the near future, we can continue to ignore the impact and the role that enterprises, big companies, industries are playing or should be playing in the development of curriculum or in the development of what we need to be as a university?
It's a really good question. Thank you for your listening and your response. The critical point I'm trying to make here is that we need to understand where it is that we want to go, what we think the vision might actually be. And to be really clear what we think the role of higher education is over the next 50 years, if that's the sort of timescale that we're thinking about. And I suppose what concerns me is a couple of things. One is that we're already seeing commercial companies taking an active interest in education as a place to make profit. At that point, the overarching driver stops being the educational purpose and the common and the public good, and it becomes about delivering shareholder value, it becomes about making profits. That to me is not going to be appropriate over the long term. I think what we need to be doing is saying, what is the structural role that we want education to be playing in our societies? And at various points, we may want to bring commercial companies in to provide subsidiary roles, to play important specific activities, but the idea that we should allow them, if you like, to own and control education, and that education should be seen as a new market, as it is increasingly. And one of my colleagues, Ben Williamson, for example, at Edinburgh University, is doing a lot of work looking at the way in which education is increasingly being seen as a new market for major investment. And I think this is a very dangerous and troubling direction. We need to remember that education is a public good.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your opinion and your answer. I have here a question of Dr. Said. He says, as a whole approach or institutional approach, we should come first curriculum or operations and services for the university of the future, you think?
I'm always just going to say curriculum. What is it that we think we're trying to do? One of the great educational philosophers and thinkers, a good old friend of mine, now retired, Michael Fielding, talks about the functional and the personal in education. And he draws on McMurray, the great philosopher. And he says that you need both the personal and the functional. The personal is about our relationships with each other. It's about the curriculum. It's about what it is that we're trying to achieve. And the functional is, if you like, how we go about achieving it. And his argument is it's not one or the other, but that the functional always has to be in support of the personal. So the operations always have to be in support of the curriculum, the educational goals.
Thank you so much, Keri. I have another question from Jose Luis Guzman. He says, his question is, how do we embrace shared futures from diverse social and cultural backgrounds or contexts?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most difficult and important questions that we face today. What's clear is that the imagination of the future is being colonized by small groups of people with particular interests. The aim is to identify opportunities for commercial benefit, and what we need to do is to challenge that. And this is why I think universities, this is the point I'm trying to make in this talk, is that universities have a really important role as public organizations to disrupt, if you like, inherited old ideas about the future that we're being given, and create the space to make it possible to imagine better, seriously sustainable futures. That means that universities need to get good at opening their doors, listening to diverse forms of expertise, and get really, really good at supporting people to listen to each other, to create what is being called in some spaces brave spaces, where we listen to views and ideas that we might find challenging and difficult. So absolutely, I mean, I think, you know, that's a question of practice. We've got to get a lot better at doing that.
Thank you so much, Keri. We have one last question, I think, in the forum, and I'm going to read it. It's a kind of long question, but I will read it here. In developing countries, education is seen as a key out of poverty. So the major goal for a student is to ultimately earn an income, not to solve social problems. How can a balance be achieved between ensuring that students exit with an ability to solve local problems as well as an ability to earn a living?
This is one of my favorite questions because it suggests a sort of separation out between the kind of social world and income and paid employment. One of the things that I think we've made a mistake. Human capital theory doesn't really make any sense, and I can have a much longer conversation with you about that. But have a look at Phil Brown's recent book if you want to see that. But basically, the idea that that we get economic well-being out of just paid employment is an inaccurate description. We know that we get economic well-being out of functioning states, out of functioning communities, out of good relationships, out of having caring communities that are able to feed themselves, secure themselves. So the conversation that I'm increasingly having with my students is a really fundamental one, which is, what does security look like for you? What does well-being look like for you? And what percentage of that is made up of formal employment and money in the money exchange, and how much of that is about the community that's around you? And once you have that conversation with students, you start having a very different perspective, which is that there is an awareness that you need to think about not just how you sell yourself on the marketplace, but how you create communities in which you can live and achieve well-being. So these are the much more fundamental questions that we have to have, fundamental conversations that we have to have with our students. We simply can't be promising them that jobs in the formal marketplace are going to be enough for them. Just to sidetrack on that, if we look at the implications of climate change, and if we look at the growing wealth inequalities, and if we look at some of the forecasts around economic inequality and precarious employment, it's very clear that if we're just educating our students to get jobs in the marketplace, we are not educating them for a world, for the world that is in development. We're not educating them in a way that is going to give them the sort of economic security that they think about. And it's our job to have a much richer sense of what constitutes economic security when we look at the sorts of changes that are likely to be happening over the next 50 or so years.
Thank you, Keri, so much. Thank you for these fascinating ideas that you leave us to think about, to read about, to explore with our colleagues. Thank you so much for your presentation. We really appreciate your being here and taking the time to prepare the video and answer these questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Martha. Thanks.
Now, to all the public here and to all the audience, the next session is going to be a panel session. It's going to be facilitated by my colleague and friend, Andrea Mangiatordi for University of Milan Bicocca. And I invite you all to stay for this panel and to participate actively, listening and also answering questions. Thank you so much for being with us. And I pass the microphone to Andrea. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you, Marta, and thanks to all the organizers of this wonderful event. I'm so honored to be here, to be a facilitator for this next session, the first thematic session we have today. And I'm also honored to be having in this session 4 people, 3 of whom I am already connected with, and 1 of whom I am not directly connected to, but in some way she represents something from my past. I will tell you why. The 4 speakers of this session are Eva Cendon from the University of Hagen in Germany. Eva, are you? Can you? I'm sorry. I'm just okay. Can you please Okay, turn on your cameras. Eva Cendon, who is in, we are currently running a European project together, coordinated by her. And I will post her biography in the chat in order to save time, since we are a little bit late on the agenda. But the same applies for my other friend, Dorothée Schulte, formerly from University of Aachen in Germany also, and now working for the German Ministry of Education. And then we have Emma Sabzalieva. I hope I didn't mispronounce your surname. Emma is a senior policy analyst at the UNESCO International Institute of Higher Education. From her biography, I get she works basically mostly with Latin America and Asia. Correct, Emma? And the connection is that I have been working in Latin America for some time and during my PhD. And the fourth speaker, we will see the recorded presentations, is my other good friend, Mpine Makoe. Mpine, are you there? Okay, nice to have you here with us. And her and Sindile Ngubane, who you already met today, and Mpine hosted me some time ago in South Africa. I was there as a visiting researcher for 1 week. And so it's this is an opportunity to virtually meet again and be in touch during this very intense and imaginative workshop conference we are having. And so I think now, from the organization of this conference, we will have the 4 videos of your presentations. So I ask you, Eva, Dorothée, Emma, and Mpine, to stay there and be ready to answer the questions that will be flowing, I think, through the chat, seeing the interest that your presentations will bring, the interesting topics that you brought into your presentations. The title of this panel is Studies on the Futures of Higher Education. And this is very interesting because we now have the opportunity to think a little bit about how research is framing the future of higher education, how researchers from all around the world are addressing these topics. And from your videos, we will learn about what you have been studying so far, what the main results are. And we will have then a 10 minutes discussion, which I am sure will be very, very interesting. So now I kindly ask, well, I didn't introduce myself, but that's irrelevant. And I will just go on and ask to the directors of this event to start playing the video, which was recorded together by Eva Cendon and Dorothée Schulte about their study, their future study, the Delphi study about the future of higher education. Thank you very much.
Hello, and thank you very much for inviting us to this inspiring event on the futures of higher education. We are very excited to discuss our views with you.
In the next minutes, we will present our view on the futures of higher education, as well as our approach and findings of our own study regarding this topic.
Well, the topic is the engagement in research on the future of teaching and learning in higher education. We are talking about methodological considerations and findings. Well, when we have a look ahead, what things that are already pressing issues in these times and developing further and further, we see different drivers that already are pervading different areas of our lives. I think one of the most important things in this way is digitalization, which is pervading all areas of our work, of learning, and also of living together. I think a second aspect is the increasing international competition that we feel, even when we think about the tools we use or how we work together. We have radically changing working environments in some areas, or some work environments. It's in a way that it's really upside down, thinking, for example, of journalism, of media, of things where we really things are where nothing is as it was. We have the changing environmental conditions, thinking of the climate change that we feel in our environments, and like the Fridays for Future that are like fighting against that, and also the different things on policy levels, be it globally, but also European or nationally, where we try to find solutions for saving our environment and for becoming sustainable. And last but not least, something that we discussed in the education sector, I would say for decades until now, the issue of lifelong learning and the need for continuous learning, which I would say has accelerated within the last years again, due to the topics that I already mentioned before. Questions that arise for higher education, not only for higher education, but for teaching and learning as such. How will teaching and learning be shaped in the future? And how will the learners of the futures look like? So what are the persons we will work with and learn with? What skills and what competences will be needed? And what does this mean for higher education institutions of the future? There exist already different future images on how our future could be shaped within higher education. They are mostly based on futures research and trend studies. I think one important aspect is, as already mentioned, the transformation of the education system through digitalization. So that means there are so many transforming factors which we already feel, and that means that that means something for our educational system. Another take on future images are the diversified learning biographies and the individual learning path. It's a topic that already in the topic of lifelong learning is something that already is with us for already some time, but we can see that already now at our universities, the different biographies, how people come back, leave the universities and come back in different phases of their lives, and also their working lives. Another take or image, you could say, is the fluid structures and the diverse profiles of universities already shaping. For example, here looking at our own country in Germany, where we can see that new profiles arise and that lifelong learning gets a new and different on the agenda. And last but not least, with the issue of which skills and competences are needed in the future, there is already quite some research done by a colleague with ELAS on the issue of future skills, which means on the one hand, what skills and competences do single persons need, but on the other hand, also what skills and competences are needed by organizations. When we look at the last, 2 years, we see the COVID pandemic as both a disruptor, which meant closures, cancellations, dropouts, but also as accelerator. And I think colleagues who are working in distance universities or online universities saw that we have an upheaval of online teaching, of course, and overnight digitalization is a topic, and it's not something in a very specific small area, but it's something that is streamlined at the moment. And the pandemic is also a burning lens. With look on funding issues, on the issue of infrastructure, and of course also on social safeguards. So in a nutshell, when we look at the pandemic, we can see it as accelerator for innovation in teaching and learning, also new chances for equitable and inclusive higher education, but on the other hand, also an increase in inequality among learners we need to take care of. And the issue of the digital divide, also discussed already some decades, but becoming more visible and systematically excluding learners, as also quite a lot of studies showed. There are some requirements for the future of future-oriented higher education, also posed by the International Commission on the Futures of Education in the last year. One is really this sustained continuity of teaching and learning. The issue that we all feel at our institutions to provide long-term solutions, and not only like things that we need to do now, but that we forget in the next moment when things are different again, and to provide accessible learning conditions. And I think with that, we will get on this course that the International Commission is looking for. So, well, I think I already said a lot about why future studies, but I think the important thing is, of course, the future is not predictable, but it can be shaped. And this is why I think we should engage in studies about the future, and thereby focusing on the potential change. And I think with these studies, at least I can say that for the group I'm within for these studies, it forces us to think about what we expect or what we aspire. And it helps us to identify what we do not know, but what we need to know for the future. And this is also with look on policies, it enables us to make necessary changes and to make intelligent decisions.
Now I like to introduce our approach and methodology we use for our study. We made use of a participative multi-step future study approach, which consists of different methods to collect and analyze data in order to describe what the future of teaching and learning in higher education may look like. And one part of our analysis was data collected in 2017 and 18 by Delphi interviews and some further expert interviews from different higher education institutions from across the world. And the experts were asked about assumptions on the future of higher education. And then by end of 2019, beginning 2020, a total of 3 workshops were held with a scenario team of researchers as well as international experts, which details I will describe when zooming into the scenario development process itself. And last but not least, in mid-2020, the University of the Future Network was asked to contribute perspectives to the UNESCO Futures of Education initiative. And 3 focus groups were conducted with experts from the network. And the aim there was to examine the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the future of teaching and learning in higher education. Next, please. Now I would like to say just a few words about the chosen methods. The Delphi method is a multi-stage qualitative experts interview approach, and this is used to gain well-founded assessments of future developments. And for example, experts rate trends according to the possibility of occurrence in the future. And whereas a scenario approach is a procedure to develop future images with a concrete target position to describe hypothetical future situations, and scenarios allow us to comprehend the challenges and opportunities that may be present in the future. And last but not least, focus groups are moderated group discussions on a predefined topic and used to gain a group opinions. Next, please. Now I will zoom into the scenario process to show the interaction of the collected data and the methodological approach up to the results of our study. So here you see a standard scenario development process in 5 phases, which I will describe step by step to bring our approach closer to you. First, we identified our scenario field. This means to define the framework and subjects that need to be integrated into the scenario process. So in the first step, we had to define the time horizon, which we set to midterm until 2030 with reference to the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And to find our subject, we then analyzed the Delphi and interviews results from 2017 and 18 in order to extract trend assumptions related to teaching and learning in higher education. And by this, we got a selection of 76 influencing factors within the dimensions you see here in this chart that frames the scope and subject areas to be considered. Next, please. After this, we look deeper into the selected influencing factors in order to identify the so-called key factors. And key factors are the ones that are possible drivers for future developments and thus are essential for the scenario process. And in order to develop meaningful scenarios, the influencing factors that are most impactful and least predictable are of interest. And in the first of our 3 workshops, a research team specified the degree of uncertainty and impact for the influencing factors. And as a result, we got a set of 5 key factors, you see here in blue, that are also called driving forces. And above that, we also evaluated so-called potential jokers and significant trends, you also see here. And potential jokers are those factors that are not expected to have much impact. However, they should be monitored even though they have a high degree of uncertainty. And whereas significant trends have a high degree of impact, even though they were considered to be of low uncertainty. And these factors are used for the scenario storylines later on. Next, please. The third phase is the key factor analysis. This phase is the core of the scenario development process. Here, we analyze the key factors according to their possible development in the future. This is also known the scenario funnel you see here as example, in that it opens and widens the imaginable perspective into possible futures. Therefore, a second workshop was held with international experts who were asked to formulate hypotheses on possible alternative future developments of the 5 selective driving forces. And this resulted in a set of hypotheses which ranged from 7 to 9 hypotheses per driving force. And the aim here was to examine the range of outcomes that may be produced in the future. Next, please. Phase 4 then aimed to gain and elaborate the scenarios themselves. This happened by defining consistent and plausible combinations of possible future developments of the driving forces. There are many creative methods that could have been considered for the selection, but for us, the so-called morphological analysis was considered to be appropriate for our approach. Here you select 1 hypothesis per key factor and combine them to plausible bundles of hypotheses. So within a third workshop, this was the last one, with a scenario team, a set of 4 different bundles of hypotheses was selected as basis for the scenario construction. These raw scenarios were proofread according to the criteria plausibility, consistency, and selectivity, and were then elaborated to narrative storylines, which I will introduce under findings. And last but not least, there is the optional phase of scenario transfer. This goes beyond the general scenario process, and as scenarios are future images of consistency and plausibility, disruptive and unexpected events, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, are not addressed. Therefore, scenarios tend to miss discontinuities, and you can use the scenario transfer to challenge and discuss possible consequences for the scenarios against the background of an undisrupted event that enters the future image. And we use the data from our focus groups for the discussions of our scenarios. I will also introduce this within the findings. Next, please. Now I will introduce some findings from our study. And following on from the scenario development process, we were able to outline 4 scenarios, which are possible future images on what teaching and learning might look like in the future. They are constructed as narrative stories, which tend to be provocative, exaggerated, in order to be memorable and different. And I just give a very short words on the scenarios to introduce them to you. The first scenario is shaped by traditional forms of teaching and learning. In this context, learning is considered higher level learning, shaped by an understanding of an exclusive education presented to a very well-selected group. Here, digital learning has become a central part of everyday life, but it stays mainly outside university and is seen as lower level learning. The scenario 2, parallel universes. Here we have parallel teaching and learning universes. And here universities shape their profiles through the usage or non-usage of technology. So students use technology in a much more personalized way, and teachers use student-centered and problem-oriented approaches for their teaching. And the third scenario focuses on how companies such as Microsoft or Google are driving the digitalization of teaching and learning in higher education institutions by taking over as main suppliers for digital learning. No longer is university staff designing their own approach, and teaching focuses on conformity rather than on creativity and critical thinking. And last but not least, in the fourth scenario, the digital matrix is a buzzword. So digitalization has grown in unimagined dimension with inventions such as the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, and neurobrands. The teaching faculty has become largely redundant, and self-developing algorithms create curricula. Next, please. And since the COVID-19 pandemic, it seems obvious that education will not be the same post-COVID-19, as we had to move from traditional ways of learning to online learning. And our focus group results strengthen the assumption that the impact of COVID-19 will lead to new ways of doing things in higher education. And it was seen as important to discuss the conditions of accessibility and inclusivity in higher education in this respect. And in view of the finding of our focus groups, teaching and learning in higher education should bridge the digital divide that manifests in different types of inequalities, support online and autonomous learning to achieve skills for self-directed learning, diversify higher education by embracing open education principles of access and inclusivity, and adopt blended learning approaches to ensure that education is accessible to students with a diversity of needs. And of course, to address the gross inequalities in higher education by providing flexible personalization of learning and supporting students' individual learning pathways. And looking at our scenarios against this background of our focus group results, none of the future images is ideal, but each of them highlights certain aspects. Scenario 1 shows us where the past can lead if the experience with forced online teaching and learning are perceived as negative. And as a result, a sort of backlash could happen, and this scenario hides the new possibilities and manifest inequalities. Whereas scenario 2 comes closest to the idea of a future higher education that allows personalized and flexible learning opportunities, or where students can choose the most suitable approach autonomously. And scenario 3 shows where the past can lead when the commercialization of higher education becomes predominant and the educational and social aspects of learning take a backseat. Scenario 4 did not look like it had a chance in a traditional teaching and learning environment, but since COVID-19, there's a distinct possibility that it will be more likely to be adopted in the future. In summary, all of the scenarios provide points of reference for discussion that need to be held in order to rethink the future of teaching and learning in higher education.
Well, 2 or 3 last words on the conclusions. Why to engage in research on the future of teaching and learning in higher education? I think what already we in our studies found out, it provides a starting point for further discussions. This is something very important. Furthermore, it gives us inspiration to actively rethink the future, not only think, but rethink. It provides path to strategic considerations for aspirational futures, and it forces us to focus on the long term. And last but not least, I think most important for higher education institutions as such is it can help us to remain agile and adaptive. And with that, I would like to thank you very much. And we are looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks for this video. And since we are a bit late on the agenda, I will quickly ask to proceed with the next video and again ask you to write down your questions in the chat or in the Q&A functionality of Zoom, and I will take care of running a quick and on the point questions and answers session at the end of it. So we will now proceed with Emma Sabzalieva's video, which is about the public consultation UNESCO ran about the future of higher education. Thank you. Looks like we're having an issue.
Virginia.
Okay. Okay, we see it now.
All right, it's just loading. Sorry about that.
Well, it looks like the video isn't coming up. I don't know if you want to proceed to the next one, or we can anticipate one of the questions that are coming in. I don't know, I ask them. Okay. In the meantime, I'll read out loud one question that has come in through the question and answer system, which is: considering poor infrastructures prevalent in most universities in the developing countries, do you think digitalization of education, which was a huge topic in Eva and Dorothee's presentation, is accomplishable within the nearest future? So let's try out these scenarios. Eva and Dorothée, you can think about an answer about this. And I don't know, I'm looking at Bridge Innovation in Learning, if they have news about the videos. Okay. Looks like we are there, nearly there.
Greetings from sunny South Africa. It's really a pleasure for me to share with you about the futures of higher education in 2050. We are looking at the horizon of 2050 because that's where we want to be. That's where we aspire to be. My name is Mpine Makoe. I'm a Commonwealth of Learning Chair at the University of South Africa. But today I'm going to speak to you as a technical leader in the University of the Future, as part of the theme of the UNESCO's World Higher Education Conference. That's going to take place in May in Barcelona. So some of you may ask yourself, why the futures? We talk about the future because as people, we are always engaged in our imagination about the future. The future is something that we imagine all the time. And because we imagine it all the time, we need to start thinking about what is it that we aspire for. The futures of higher education are there to contribute to discussions on the futures of higher education and to recommend actions towards visioning process. The future is about visioning, having a vision of what would look like and what you would like something to look like. The other part is that the Futures of Higher Education offers a methodology that could be used or adapted for designing and developing scenarios for the futures of higher education in different contexts. So I'm going to talk about the scenario development. But before we start with the scenarios development, you need to have a clear vision of what you want the future to look like. The vision that we have has to be based on how do we reimagine the communities of the future, the communities of 2050. What is it that the political space may look like? What is the social space may look like? What is the education space may look like? And once we understand how the community will look like, then we get to look at how we would like higher education to support that community in order for us to achieve what we need to do. So in the visioning process, you must have something that pulls you forward. You must have a visionary lens that pulls you forward. In this project, we used common good as a visionary lens. Common good, we use it because it's based on the principles that ensures that every person have equitable access to quality education. It also encourages people to work together and share responsibilities as a collective for the benefit of the community or society. You'll recall that higher education has been criticized for being individualized, for being competitive, for not supporting communal for not supporting diverse knowledges as well. And also in higher education, we follow one stream and we follow the knowledges of other people that are not really helpful in our environment. They are not helpful in the ecological and scientific spaces. So this allows us to be collectively producing this knowledge as individuals from different communities that the world belongs to. So the ultimate goal is to provide a vision where every member of society can develop to their full capacities and able to interact with themselves and contribute meaningfully to the community that they live in. The second thing that we used, the second concept that we use as a visioning process is the social justice framework. The social justice framework addresses issues of equality, equity, and issues of economic equality. We know that when people do not have finances that allows them to participate fully in higher education, they remain excluded from the higher education space. So we are looking at it in terms of economic, the redistribution of access, the redistribution of wealth, and not necessarily taken from those that have to those that do not have, but specifically looking at how best can we ensure that everybody has access to higher education as they should be. If we understand the role of higher education, we also look at the equitable access. So it's important for us to bring up people who have been excluded in the past. We cannot just say, especially where I come from in South Africa, where we have gone with the equality mandate and moved along with the equality mandate. What it does is that those that always had opportunities to be at the center, they continue to have those opportunities. And whereas those that did not have, they remain behind. But when you look at equitable access, you ensure that that one who did not have access in the past is supported to get to the level at which they can perform and they can be the best that they could be. So as we were imagining a world that is different from our world today, and this is the imaginative process. When you deal with futures, you are not dealing with plans that are going to take place in 3 or 5 years. You are dealing with plans that are going to deal with issues in the next 30, 40, 50 years. So futures are more about the horizon while strategies are more about the plans that addresses the issues that we are dealing with. So we are trying to move away from that space to looking at scenarios, imagining a world that is completely different from this world. So here we developed scenarios, and these scenarios present different images of the future. And these scenarios, as we were developing it, it's something that was in our imagination. It's something that we based it on the literature, we based it on the trends, we based it on what is happening now, and we also based it on our hopes for the future. So our hope for the future is something that probably we have not even considered or even thought about, but we look at it as a possibility. We also used the scenarios to challenge some of the existing paradigms that are not working, so that in some instances, we may need to get rid of certain things while we move forward with certain things. Thirdly, it may be possible or probable, the future may be possible or probable or preferable. It doesn't have to be what we think it should be. So we generated 4 scenarios. One scenario was on open education. We believe that the future of education is likely to be accessible, flexible, student-centered, and in that way, we remove the boundaries that the education system has created around us. Secondly, it will be network learning hubs. Now with the internet, with the technology that allows us to communicate across contexts, across countries, across regions, you find that someone who's a farmer somewhere starts developing a program for all farmers. So you'll have a network community of farmers who exchange ideas, who doesn't have to go into formal training for doing this, but they're exchanging ideas amongst peers. The third one is about ecologically sustainable. We know that we have problems with climate change. We know that as human beings, we have not been good to the world we live in, to the planet we live in. So higher education needs to address issues of climate change, and they need also to address issues of the ecology, so that human and planet coexist as they always did in the past, as they always did in the previous years before we became so modernized. They knew and they understood that these two must work together. And finally, the future has to be developmentally driven. Coming from a developing context, it is very, very essential for us that the future is developmental, so that we can be able to develop our countries. The higher education that we have has not been able to address some of the developmental needs of our country. It has not been able to address some of the economic needs of our country, or even social needs of our country. And therefore, we look at higher education not only for a higher education that addresses the labor market, but higher education that addresses us as human beings, that centers humanity in order for us to develop the countries that we live in. So in that space, I will leave this conversation here as we move forward, and I will entertain any discussions that we have henceforth. And from here, we are going to move into the breakaway session.
Somehow the video stopped.
It was finished.
Oh, okay. And then it's time to try again. Are you sure it was finished? It seemed a little bit abrupt, but okay. Now we consulted with Emma Sabzalieva, and she's trying. Okay, no, now we have the. Okay, thank you very much, Bridge. And we have now the third video in this panel. Let's see if we can play it from here. There's no sound, sorry. And I'm afraid it's just not passing through.
If there are difficulties with the audio and the video, perhaps Emma can present something shortly.
I'm happy to share my
with...
screen. I can't share my screen, but I'm happy to do it. And then I can try to show the video from my side.
Yes, that would be the best thing. That's the best solution.
UNESCO, International
there we
Institute
go.
for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean, or ESALC, is very happy to present our report, Pathways to 2050 and Beyond, Findings from a Public Consultation on the Futures of Higher Education. In this short presentation, we'll share some of the many insightful ideas from the public consultation and plant some seeds of thought that everyone can reflect on. You can access our report in English and Spanish as a downloadable document from the QR code on screen now, as well as through an interactive web-based presentation of the findings. And in support of open science, we've also made the full data set publicly available for use by researchers, learners, and policymakers around the world. ESALC's Futures of Higher Education project is our institute's contribution to the broader UNESCO initiative on the futures of education, and the report Reimagining Our Futures Together that was published by the International Commission in November 2021. Higher education has been identified as a catalyst for the necessary new social contract for education. And in our Futures of Higher Education project, we focus on creating visions for desirable future scenarios, moving beyond the business as usual approach. You'll notice that we use futures in the plural to emphasize the multiple promising paths that may lie ahead. Our work on the futures of higher education has 3 phases. Phase 1, an expert consultation, culminated in the launch of the report Thinking Higher and Beyond in May 2021, and the publication of 25 concept notes written by a series of global higher education experts. Phase 2, this public consultation, is what we're presenting today. And phase 3 is a youth consultation that began in December 2021 and will continue in 2022.
For the public consultation, we developed a survey that asked participants to think ahead to 2050 and to tell us first what they're most hopeful about and what they're most concerned about as they imagine their future horizons. Then, we extended this future thinking to the role that higher education can play in those futures. We asked respondents the same 2 questions that were asked in our expert consultation. How would you like higher education to be in 2050? And how could higher education contribute to better futures for all in 2050? The public consultation was open for 10 weeks between May and August 2021. It was an online survey that was open to everyone and was available in 4 languages: English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and Spanish. Participants were also able to submit their responses in Chinese. We designed the consultation using principles of access, engagement, and flexibility to hear from as many people as possible. As noted, the survey could be completed in multiple languages. There were a limited number of questions that did not require too much time to complete, and respondents had opportunity to share their ideas using free text responses.
As a result of this global reflection on the futures of higher education, 1,199 valid responses from all world regions were analyzed. The interest in the consultation was very high, and we were delighted that people in 97 countries were able to participate. In terms of regional representation, just over half of respondents came from Latin America and the Caribbean, a quarter from Asia and the Pacific, 13% from Europe and North America, 4% from Africa, and 1% from the Arab States region. People of all ages shared their visions about the future in 2050. Most of them were between the ages of 31 to 60, And for every 3 women who responded, 2 men participated in the public consultation.
Following our analysis of the responses, this is how we visually imagine our pathways to 2050 and beyond. These form the foundation for our futures, each pathway representing a route from which we can grow. The routes are all connected: quality of life, social change, care of the environment, and development of technology. In quality of life, there are healthy humans living well. Due to social change, we live in a socially just society. Through care of the environment, we inhabit a flourishing planet that we take better care of, and where the advanced development of technology supports these harmonious relations with the self, others, and nature.
From this foundation, we now move to exploring the different roles that higher education could play in 2050. Based on what respondents said, the report discusses higher education in 2050 in 4 main areas: higher education for all, student-centered, organization of knowledge, and connected at multiple levels. To make sure that respondents' voices were clearly heard throughout, we use direct quotes from the consultation in the naming of the themes in this part of the report.
Higher education for all, available and affordable to all, means that in 2050, higher education will be available and affordable to everyone. Universities and colleges will be safe and welcoming spaces for all. More driven by social justice, higher education will be more inclusive and diverse in terms of learners, faculty, and staff. It will be more contextualized to current global challenges and be more practice and experiential to include various academic and cultural offerings. Widening access to higher education will not come at the cost of quality. They will be parceled together as inclusion with quality. In 2050, higher education will nurture and nourish every student's talents and potential. Have you ever wanted to choose your own time to complete a course and work at your own pace? Well, for students in 2050, this will be the norm as higher education becomes more student-centered and student choice-driven. Students will actively participate in their own learning by choosing programs and courses according to their own interests and driven by their own personal growth. Students will develop skills for their life and skills for responsible citizenship that will be useful not only to them, but to their local communities and in protecting the environment. But it's not just skills for development. Students will also be driven by values-oriented action that will also be at the heart of higher education institutions' mission. This is a 2050 world in which society will be kinder and citizens will be more compassionate.
So to make all of this happen, what changes might be needed in the organization of knowledge? For a start, learning will be everywhere, offered in multiple modalities and formats, happening at any time, online and offline, as formal degree programs and through informal learning. We'll need more emphasis on training good teachers in higher education, people who will be committed to values such as respect, empathy, and innovation, who take a creative approach to education and who have more freedom to choose how to teach courses. More emphasis will be placed on diverse knowledge and ways of knowing, teaching, and learning that is widely accessible, focuses on the common good, and on local and global needs. It's not only teaching that will change. Higher education will be underpinned by innovative research that has an impact on society and is supported by governments. Cutting across its functions, higher education will be connected at multiple levels, serving society in inclusive ways and helping to solve complex problems. higher education institutions will improve the situation of the planet through educating students, through research, and by reaching out to the general population. Because it will have a global context with local essence, higher education will understand the challenges and opportunities of the local environment without detracting attention from global issues. All of this calls for higher education without borders, opening horizons, working collaboratively, and promoting academic mobility, all based on tolerance, respect, and the needs of diverse communities in the planet.
All of this sets the scene for a range of desirable futures where higher education supports us and its communities in every step. Would you like to live in a world like this in 2050? Participants from all over the world have an affirmative yes to this question. So how do we get from today to the futures envisaged by our respondents? Based on what we heard in the public consultation, we're putting forward 6 calls to action. These are invitations for everyone, for students, teachers, children, adults, researchers, decision makers, leaders, and more. The first call is to advocate for the right to higher education. In the future, higher education's role for society and communities needs to be further expanded. For this, mechanisms that promote the attainment of this right must be in place.
Second, the right to higher education must go hand in hand with addressing the barriers that limit participation. Policy changes that support students in reaching their full potential and devising new ways to promote and finance access to higher education are some of the issues that should be targeted to achieve this. Third, we need to more actively open up the access to knowledge. We can start by translating knowledge into different languages, publishing in open access journals, making course content freely available, and using technology to reach remote communities. These are all highly pragmatic and achievable options that are already underway.
Fourth, we must collectively empower the next generation to express themselves and to take leadership in their own futures. Young people must be heard when we design higher education. They're the ones who will benefit from it next and set the path for those who follow them. Fifth, we need to strive for higher education to be more relevant. We call on students and teachers to push for changes in higher education with support, guidance, and funding from civil society and policymakers.
Finally, although 2050 may seem unreachable, it is in fact closer than we might imagine, less than 30 years from now. That is why we advocate for everyone to become future thinkers, to anticipate future challenges, and push for change now.
Alongside the other actions our institute is taking, we have also been inspired to take up the call to listen to the voices of the next generations. In this public consultation, we realized that youth participation was quite modest at about 20% of participation. Yet the youth of today are the citizens of tomorrow. And hearing their perspectives on the futures and higher education in those futures is critical. That's why we have launched a global youth consultation as the third phase in our work in the futures of higher education. Stay tuned for more insights and perspectives in 2022.
It's been really exciting to reflect on these visions of the futures with a wide range of participants. The insights and thoughts shared in this public consultation are meant for further reflection and action. So with that in mind, we invite you to download the report, to engage with our interactive presentation of the findings, and to access the dataset used in the public consultation. Links can be found through the QR codes you see on screen now. And Don't forget to keep in touch with us at ESALC and tell us what you think might lie ahead in the futures of higher education.
Okay, thanks to our virtual presenters for these very interesting and insightful presentations. I have thought about one maybe generic, but I think very much connecting question that could be posed to them, and that would also integrate some topics that emerged from your questions, from the people that are following us. And there's one word I think that is relevant to all your presentation, which is barriers. Also in the best case scenarios, we can, or you in your studies, have foreseen barriers that have to be overcome in order for higher education to go somewhere, to develop into something that is new, that is different, that is in the future. And so I kindly ask Eva, Dorothée, and Mpine, who still have their cameras off. Okay, now I see you. And my question is quite simple, and but well, very wide, so you can decide what is your take on this. But if you had to outline one main barrier that in some way we need to overcome in order to develop a future, the universities of the future, what would that barrier be? We will have to be very quick because we are like 10 minutes late on the agenda. The parallel sessions should have started 10 minutes ago. So I ask you to be brief, but I thank you again for your contributions so far.
If I may start,
yes,
Andrea,
please, Eva.
also to be quick, I think one barrier is the universities itself, actually, in some way within their structures, in how they constructed, they're for good reasons resistant to changes. But for becoming agile, I think we need to think anew how we want to work with each other within our institutions and also across our institutions. And with that, I think the topic of imagination, futures research, future workshops, what we call Zukunftswerkstatt in the German context, or other ways of thinking of future are highly relevant to, like, how would you say, put down some of these barriers and think a bit out of the box. Thanks.
Andrea, if I can, sorry, Dorothée, but if I can sort of add to that. So first, I just want to make sure that people know that the presentation that was attributed to me was actually a team endeavor. You saw me talking on the recording there with two of my colleagues, Dana Brashova and Bosen Leleu. We're also joined in our team with Eglis Chacon and Luz Camara Caballero. So just want to make sure people know that there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes for you to see that short presentation, which I'm really glad we had a chance to show. I actually want to flip your question around, Andrea. I think what we've heard so far from our keynotes, from the brilliant introductory speeches, from the excellent presentations in this panel, is that we actually have a pretty good hold on what the barriers are. So actually what we need, though, are the tools to enable us to not only to overcome the barriers, but to think about the futures of higher education from different perspectives. And in that way, and I think Professor Makoe's presentation, which builds on the work that's being done in the framework of the World Higher Education Conference and the scenarios, which also come up in the other presentation, really invite us to consider how we can take up those methodologies to enable us to think about desirable futures. So perhaps less to hold on to what are the things that we want to drop, which aren't so good or have been undesirable in the past or in the present, which we know are true and we must confront, we must deal with. But we also must add to that the importance of imagining our desirable futures so that we know what we can work towards. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Emma. And
if I may add a point,
yes,
Andrea,
please, Dorothée.
I think it's explicitly what you say, because I think these approaches can help us to change a mindset from being active instead of being reactive, and as universities to think about what we as universities aspire and what direction we want to take. And these approaches can help us to get images of a future we think, which where developments developments can lead to and what we aspire, and then to think about what do we have to do to reach a certain situation in the future we aspire, or to avoid a certain situation in the future we do not aspire. That's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Andrea.
Dorothée.
Thanks, Andrea, for that question, because it also brings to the fore why we are here. We are here to just imagine and go wild in our imagination. And when we imagine, because that's the life we live in our own heads, in our own imagination. When you imagine, you don't imagine something that doesn't work. You imagine something that may work for you. So if we start making people think about not what had happened, what happened has passed, but what we need to imagine going forward. COVID also has brought us to the fore of beginning to imagine things very quickly. But if we had set as an higher education and saying that the world is changing, technologies has been here with us for more than 30 years, and what is it that we need to do to prepare people for that world? Even the people that we attract in our space, they are here because they have certain images of themselves in the future. We have certain images of ourselves in the future. We are engaged in imagining things. So I think we need to begin to imagine our spaces, because that's what we are engaged in. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My question was exactly based on the idea that when we imagine spaces, when we design spaces, we have to think, and I say that as a universal design researcher, we have to think about the barriers that could present and that are the most difficult thing to foresee when you are being imaginative, as you say, Mpine. So thank you very much for your answer, Mpine and all the others. And there would be another question from Marta in the chat, but Mpine, if you agree with me, I would say that you can take that question with you in the next session, in the parallel sections you're running. And that would be due to the trend that the world is taking, more inequality, poverty, expensive tuitions to attend universities, etc. Is it irresponsible to have positive thoughts about the future of higher education? Well, I think that's a very insightful question, and maybe you can discuss it in the next session. I leave the word to you now, Mpine, and I thank you all for your participation, and I thank all the people that are following us at the moment, and I leave it to the next part of the conference. Thanks again.